What if the waitress everyone ignored was the only person who recognized the billionaire before the world did? Repeat that. The man's voice was low, controlled, but the entire restaurant suddenly felt colder. Sarah Mitchell froze beside the table, her tray trembling slightly in her hands. Just seconds earlier, the customer everyone assumed was poor had ordered his meal in flawless Arabic, quiet enough that no one else noticed, no one except her, and without thinking, Sarah had answered him in Arabic. Not just the language, but with a sentence no stranger should have known. The color drained from the man's face. His fingers tightened around the glass as he stared at her like he had just seen a ghost walk back into his life. Around them, wealthy guests laughed, waiters rushed past, and music played softly through the luxury restaurant. But at that table, time stopped. Because the phrase Sarah had just spoken belonged to only one person in the world. A woman who disappeared more than 20 years ago. Before we go any further, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. And don't forget to subscribe, because this story is about to reveal a secret that will change 3 lives forever. Rain hammered the streets of downtown Boston as black luxury cars lined the glowing entrance of Bellevue Restaurant. Inside, crystal chandeliers reflected against polished marble floors, while wealthy guests laughed over $1,000 bottles of wine. The restaurant was known for serving celebrities, politicians, and investors who liked to remind the world exactly how important they were. And tonight, Sarah Mitchell was already 12 hours into her shift. "Table 7 still waiting on dessert," Brenda Collins snapped from across the room. Sarah turned quickly. "I'm coming. Hurry up. These people tip more in one night than you make in a month." The words stung, but Sarah forced a smile anyway. At 29 years old, she had learned how to survive humiliation quietly. Her dark hair was tied back neatly. Her white waitress shirt was perfectly pressed despite the exhaustion in her eyes. Around her neck hung a small silver necklace she never removed, hidden beneath the collar of her uniform most days. Only tonight, the chain had slipped loose. Sarah rushed toward the kitchen while balancing 2 plates carefully in her hands. "Careful?" another waitress muttered sarcastically. "Wouldn't want the charity case losing her job." Vanessa Reed leaned against the counter, fixing her lipstick in a spoon reflection. Sarah ignored her. Vanessa loved reminding everyone that Sarah was a struggling single mother barely surviving on tips. Most nights, Sarah worked until midnight before taking another early morning shift at a grocery store bakery. All to support 2 people waiting at home: her 6-year-old daughter Grace and her sick father, Thomas Mitchell. "Mommy, are you coming home before I sleep tonight?" The memory of Grace's small voice from earlier that afternoon tightened Sarah's chest. "I'll try, sweetheart," and she had promised. But promises were difficult when rent was overdue. A loud laugh suddenly echoed near the entrance. Everyone turned. A man had just walked into the restaurant wearing a dark raincoat damp from the storm outside. His shoes were worn. No expensive watch, no designer suit, no bodyguards. He looked completely out of place. Brenda's expression immediately hardened. "Oh no," she muttered. "Not tonight." The man calmly removed his coat and glanced around the restaurant. Something about him felt strangely composed, not nervous, not embarrassed, just observant. Brenda walked toward him quickly with a forced smile already fading. "Sir," she said coldly, "this restaurant requires reservations." The man nodded politely. "I only need a table for 1. "I'm afraid we're fully booked." Sarah noticed several empty tables immediately. The man noticed too. Still, he didn't argue. "Anywhere is fine," he said calmly. Brenda crossed her arms. Perhaps the diner across the street would be more comfortable. A few nearby guests chuckled quietly. Sarah felt heat rise in her face. The man simply thanked Brenda softly and turned toward the door again. And that was the moment Sarah spoke. "Wait." The room didn't stop, but something shifted. Brenda turned sharply. "Excuse me?" Sarah swallowed nervously. "Table 12 is still open." Brenda's eyes narrowed. "That table is reserved for Mr. Bennett." "He canceled," Sarah replied carefully. Brenda looked furious that Sarah was correct. The man remained silent. Finally, Brenda forced a fake smile. "Fine, but make it quick." Sarah gestured politely toward the table near the window. "This way, sir." As the man sat down, Sarah placed a menu gently in front of him. "Can I get you something warm to drink? It's freezing outside." For the first time, the man looked directly at her. His eyes were dark, calm, intelligent, and tired. "Yes," he said quietly. "Tea would be nice." Sarah smiled softly. "I'll bring it right away." So, as she walked back toward the kitchen, Vanessa scoffed loudly. "You're really working hard for that $5 tip." Another waiter laughed. "Maybe he'll pay in expired coupons." Sarah ignored them again, but the man had heard every word. Minutes later, Sarah returned carrying hot tea and fresh bread. The man looked slightly surprised. "I didn't order bread." "You looked hungry," Sarah replied gently. "It's on the house." Something unreadable crossed his face. Nobody had spoken to Khalid al-Mansouri like that in years. Not as a billionaire hotel owner, not as one of the wealthiest investors in the Middle East, and certainly not while believing he was poor. That was exactly why Khalid had come. For months, he had secretly visited businesses his company planned to invest in. He dressed simply on purpose, testing how employees treated people who appeared unimportant. Most failed immediately. Bellevue restaurant was already failing. Khalid opened the menu slowly. Then, without warning, he spoke in Arabic. "Do you recommend the lamb tonight?" Sarah froze. The tray nearly slipped from her hands. Khalid noticed instantly. Her eyes widened for only a second before she regained composure. "Yes," she answered softly in English. "It's very good." But Khalid kept watching her carefully. Most Americans didn't react to Arabic unless they recognized it. Sarah quickly wrote down the order. Yet as she turned away, Khalid spoke again. This time slower. "In Arabic," he said quietly. "Thank you for your kindness." Sarah stopped completely. For a moment, the noise of the restaurant faded into the background. Then slowly, she answered him. In perfect Arabic. "You're welcome. Everyone deserves kindness." Khalid's expression changed instantly, because her pronunciation wasn't casual. It was natural, fluent, like someone who had grown up hearing the language. Sarah realized what she had done and immediately looked nervous. I'll bring your food soon," she said quickly. Then she walked away before he could respond. Across the room, Brenda stared suspiciously. Vanessa whispered something cruel under her breath, but Khalid barely noticed either of them anymore. His attention remained fixed on Sarah. And then he saw it. The silver necklace had slipped free again as she reached for another tray. A small engraved symbol rested against her chest. Khalid's face slowly lost color, because he recognized that symbol immediately. It belonged to the al-Mansouri family, and nobody outside the family was supposed to have it. The next night, Khalid al-Mansouri returned to Bellevue restaurant, and the night after that. Then again 3 days later. Each time, he arrived wearing ordinary clothes. No luxury car stopped outside. No assistants followed him. No one recognized one of the richest hotel investors in the world sitting quietly near the window with a simple cup of tea. Except Sarah Mitchell was beginning to notice something strange. Most wealthy men who disguised themselves eventually revealed arrogance. Khalid never did. He thanked busboys. He folded his napkin neatly before leaving, and every single time Sarah served him, he stood slightly when she approached the table, like a man raised with old-fashioned respect. That alone made him different from most of the customers at Bellevue. "You know your mystery boyfriend came back," Vanessa whispered one evening while polishing glasses behind the counter. Sarah frowned. "He's not my boyfriend." Vanessa smirked. "Please. Poor guys don't sit like that. There's something weird about him." Sarah glanced toward Khalid's table. He was reading quietly, completely unaware of the conversations around him. Or pretending to be. "I think he's lonely," Sarah said softly. Vanessa laughed loudly. "You always feel sorry for broken people." Sarah didn't answer. Maybe she did. Life had taught her how painful it felt when people looked through you instead of at you. Across the room, Khalid watched Sarah help an elderly couple cut their food because the husband's hands were shaking too badly to hold utensils properly. 10 minutes later, she carried extra soup to a homeless veteran waiting outside in the cold alley beside the restaurant. She thought no one saw her do it. Khalid did, and each small act unsettled him more than the last, because kindness without an audience had become rare, especially in places built around money. Later that night, Sarah approached his table again. "Would you like your usual tea?" Khalid smiled faintly. "You remembered." "You come here enough," she replied gently. As she poured the tea, Khalid noticed the graceful precision in her movements. Not rushed. Intentional. Then something else caught his attention. Before handing him the cup, Sarah quietly rotated the handle toward him first, a traditional Middle Eastern gesture of hospitality. Khalid looked up sharply. "Where did you learn that?" Sarah blinked. "Learn what?" "The way you served the tea." "Oh." She looked embarrassed. "I guess my mother taught me when I was little." Khalid's pulse slowed. "Your mother spoke Arabic?" "A little," Sarah answered carefully. "You speak more than a little." Sarah hesitated. The restaurant noise filled the silence between them. Finally, she shrugged slightly. "My mom used to sing in Arabic sometimes. I picked up words growing up." "What was her name?" The question came too quickly, too intensely. Sarah noticed immediately. For the first time since meeting him, uncertainty crossed her face. Why does that matter? Khalid leaned back slightly, realizing his mistake. "It doesn't," he said calmly. "I was curious." Sarah nodded slowly, though she clearly didn't fully believe him. Then Brenda's sharp voice interrupted from across the room. "Sarah, stop socializing and do your job." Several guests looked over disapprovingly. Sarah immediately stepped away from the table. "I'm sorry." Khalid watched her hurry toward another section of the restaurant, while Brenda muttered angrily behind her. "She spends more time talking than working," Brenda complained loudly enough for nearby customers to hear. "That's not true," one older customer said quietly. Brenda ignored him. Khalid's expression darkened. For years, people had treated him with artificial respect because of his wealth. But now, disguised as an ordinary man, he was finally seeing how people like Sarah were treated every day, and he hated it. 2 nights later, Bellevue became even busier than usual. A famous businessman from New York was dining there, and Brenda had ordered every employee to look expensive. Sarah barely had time to breathe. Still, she noticed Khalid enter the restaurant during the dinner rush. This time, before she could greet him, another waiter blocked his path. "We're fully booked," the waiter said dismissively. Khalid calmly glanced around at half-empty tables. "I only need 1 seat." "Yeah, well, those seats are for paying customers." Sarah overheard the comment instantly. Her face tightened. She walked over quickly. "I can take him." The waiter rolled his eyes. "Of course you can." Sarah ignored him and guided Khalid toward his usual table. As she set down the menu, Khalid spoke quietly in Arabic again. "You defend strangers often." Sarah looked startled, but answered softly in the same language. "Not strangers. People." Khalid stared at her. The fluency was undeniable now. Not memorized phrases, not tourist-level conversation. Real Arabic. "Who taught you?" he asked. Sarah lowered her eyes briefly. "My mother," she whispered. Then she immediately switched back to English. "Would you like the lamb again?" Khalid noticed the change. She was hiding something. Before he could ask more questions, Vanessa suddenly appeared beside the table. "Sarah," she said loudly, "Brenda wants to know if you're planning to marry this customer or actually serve the rest of the restaurant." A few nearby diners laughed. Sarah's cheeks flushed with humiliation. "Excuse me," she murmured, but Khalid spoke before she could leave. "That was unnecessary." Vanessa looked surprised he responded at all. Then she smirked. "Relax. We joke around here." Khalid's eyes hardened slightly. "No," he said quietly. "You humiliate people." The smile vanished from Vanessa's face. For a second, tension filled the room. Then Sarah gently interrupted. "It's okay." But Khalid could tell it wasn't. Nothing about the exhaustion in her eyes looked okay anymore. An hour later, Sarah stepped outside through the employee exit during her break. The freezing wind immediately hit her face. She pulled out her phone quickly. Khalid had followed a few minutes later without meaning to. He stopped near the alley entrance when he heard her voice, and then he froze. Sarah was speaking Arabic on the phone. Fluent, emotional, soft. "It's okay, Habibti," she whispered lovingly. "Mommy will be home soon." Khalid's breathing slowed, but it wasn't the language that shocked him. It was the lullaby she softly sang afterward. A lullaby he hadn't heard in over 20 years. The exact same lullaby his missing sister Amina used to sing as a child. And then Sarah whispered a name that made Khalid's blood run cold. "Amina, I wish you were still here." Friday night at Bellevue Restaurant was chaos wrapped in luxury. Crystal glasses clinked beneath golden chandeliers, while expensive perfume mixed with the scent of grilled steak and imported wine. Politicians, investors, and celebrities filled the dining room, all laughing loudly enough to remind everyone around them exactly how wealthy they were. And at the center of it all stood Brenda Collins, smiling nervously as she prepared for the arrival of Bellevue's most important guests. "Everyone listen carefully," she snapped at the staff. "Richard Hale and Marcus Bennett are spending over $50,000 tonight. If anything goes wrong, somebody's getting fired." Her eyes landed directly on Sarah. "Especially you." Vanessa smirked from beside the wine station. Sarah quietly nodded. She was too exhausted to argue anymore. Earlier that morning, Grace had woken up coughing again. Thomas's medication was nearly gone. Rent was overdue for the second month in a row. Losing this job would destroy everything. Still, she forced herself to breathe calmly and tied her apron tighter around her waist. "You okay?" another server whispered kindly. Sarah smiled faintly. "I have to be." At exactly 7:30, black luxury SUVs pulled up outside the restaurant. Richard Hale entered first, wearing a tailored navy suit worth more than Sarah earned in a year. Beside him walked Marcus Bennett, loud and arrogant, already laughing before he reached the host stand. Brenda nearly sprinted to greet them. "Mr. Hale? Mr. Bennett? Welcome back." Richard barely acknowledged her. His eyes swept across the restaurant lazily until they stopped near the window. Near Khalid. Even dressed simply, Khalid carried himself differently from everyone else in the room. Calm. Controlled. Unshaken. Richard frowned slightly. Who's that? He asked. Brenda glanced over dismissively. Nobody important, just some man who keeps coming in here. Marcus chuckled. Then why's he sitting by the windows? Before Brenda could answer, Sarah approached carefully. Good evening. Can I start you with… Marcus interrupted immediately. Didn't we ask for someone prettier last time? Several businessmen at the table laughed. Sarah's face warmed with humiliation. I can get another server if you'd prefer, she said quietly. Richard leaned back in his chair. No, he said slowly while looking her up and down. I think she fits the atmosphere. More laughter. Across the room, Khalid watched silently. His jaw tightened. Sarah continued taking orders professionally, despite the insults. But Marcus wasn't finished. So, he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, you're the waitress spending all her time talking to homeless customers. Vanessa snorted behind the bar. Sarah kept writing the order. I'm just doing my job. Marcus smirked. Sure you are. Richard swirled his wine thoughtfully. Single mother, right? Sarah froze slightly. The room suddenly felt smaller. How did you… People talk, Marcus interrupted. Boston's a small city. Sarah forced herself to remain calm. Yes, she answered quietly. Marcus grinned cruelly. That explains it. Silence spread across the table. Sarah looked confused. Explains what? Richard leaned forward. Women like you are always looking for opportunities. The words hit harder than Sarah expected. Around them, several guests pretended not to listen while clearly listening to everything. Nobody defended her. Nobody except one person. That's enough. Khalid's voice cut through the restaurant calmly, but the authority behind it made several people turn instantly. Marcus laughed. Oh, look, the charity project speaks. Richard studied Khalid carefully now. Something about the man felt familiar, but before he could place it, Marcus continued mocking him. You know this waitress? Khalid met his gaze evenly. I know cruelty when I see it. The table fell silent for a second. Then Marcus burst into laughter. You hear that? The guy wearing a $10 coat is lecturing us about morality. Even Brenda laughed nervously. Sarah looked mortified. Please, she whispered to Khalid softly. Don't. But Marcus stood up suddenly, grabbing his wine glass dramatically. You know what? He said loudly. Maybe we should help her out. Before anyone understood what he meant, Marcus deliberately tilted the glass. Red wine splashed directly across Sarah's white uniform. The restaurant gasped. Wine dripped slowly down her apron and onto the marble floor. For a second, nobody moved. Sarah stared down at herself, breathing shakily. Marcus smirked. Oops, and a few people laughed uncomfortably. Brenda rushed over immediately, not to help Sarah, but to protect the customers. Oh my God, she snapped. Sarah, apologize immediately. Sarah looked up in disbelief. He spilled it on purpose. Do not argue with customers. Sarah's eyes filled slightly, though she fought hard not to cry. I didn't do anything wrong. Brenda lowered her voice dangerously. You embarrass this restaurant every single night. Khalid slowly stood from his table. The movement alone shifted the atmosphere, because suddenly the entire room noticed how commanding he actually was, even in ordinary clothes, even silent. Marcus smirked mockingly. Problem? Khalid stepped closer calmly. Yes. The single word carried enough weight to silence nearby conversations completely. You humiliated a woman who has shown more dignity in one night than you've shown in your entire life. Marcus's smile faded. Richard watched Khalid carefully now, suspicion growing in his eyes. Sarah quickly stepped between them before things escalated further. Please stop, she whispered. Then quietly, in Arabic, she said to Khalid, Dignity is not given by wealth. Khalid froze instantly. The color slowly drained from his face, because those exact words, word for word, had once been spoken by his father to his missing sister Amina, years ago. Nobody else should have known them. Nobody. Richard noticed Khalid's reaction immediately, and suddenly his eyes widened slightly, as if he was finally beginning to recognize the man standing in front of him. But before anyone could speak again, Brenda grabbed Sarah's arm harshly. "That's it," she snapped. "You're done for tonight." Sarah stared at her. "What?" "You embarrassed VIP guests. Turn in your apron." The restaurant fell silent again. Sarah looked around helplessly. Nobody defended her, not the customers, not the staff, not even Vanessa, who looked almost satisfied. Sarah slowly untied her stained apron with trembling hands, and as she placed it on the table, Richard Hale continued staring at Khalid with growing shock, because he was suddenly almost certain he knew exactly who the poor man really was. Sarah Mitchell walked through the freezing Boston streets with her head lowered and her ruined apron stuffed inside her bag. The humiliation from Bellevue still burned in her chest. Every cruel laugh, every stare, every word. "Women like you are always looking for opportunities." Her hands trembled as she wiped tears from her face before reaching the apartment building. She couldn't let Grace see her crying again. The old elevator was broken, like usual. So Sarah climbed 4 flights of narrow stairs in silence while carrying leftover bread rolls the kitchen had thrown away earlier that night. By the time she reached apartment 4B, exhaustion had settled into every part of her body. But the moment the door opened, "Mommy!" Little Grace ran straight into her arms. Sarah nearly collapsed from the relief of holding her daughter. "There's my girl," she whispered softly. Grace immediately noticed the stain on Sarah's shirt. "What happened?" "Nothing, sweetheart. Mommy just had a rough night." Grace frowned seriously. "Did someone mean to you again?" Sarah forced a smile. "People are sometimes hurting inside. Hurt people can become cruel." Grace hugged her tighter. "You're never cruel." Sarah closed her eyes briefly. Those simple words hurt more than the insults at the restaurant, because she was trying so hard not to break in front of her child. Inside the apartment, an old television flickered quietly near the couch where Thomas Mitchell sat wrapped in a blanket. His coughing had grown worse over the last few months. The medical bills had grown worse too. Thomas looked up slowly when Sarah entered. "You're home late. Busy night." Then he noticed the wine stain. His expression darkened immediately. "Sarah, I'm fine, Dad. You lost the job?" Sarah hesitated. "Suspended? Maybe." Silence filled the tiny apartment. Grace quietly sat beside her grandfather while Sarah carried groceries into the kitchen. The apartment was painfully small. Water stains marked the ceiling. The heater barely worked. And yet somehow, it still felt warmer than Bellevue restaurant ever had. Sarah carefully divided the leftover bread between 3 plates. Grace noticed immediately. "Mommy, you didn't make one for yourself. I already ate at work." A lie. Thomas saw it too. But before he could speak, someone knocked at the apartment door. 3 slow knocks. Sarah frowned. Nobody visited this late. She opened the door carefully and froze. Khalid stood quietly in the hallway, holding a paper bag from a pharmacy. For a second, neither of them spoke. "You followed me?" Sarah asked softly. "I wanted to make sure you got home safely." Sarah looked exhausted, rather than angry. "You shouldn't be here. I know." Snow drifted through the broken hallway window behind him. Then Grace peeked around the corner curiously. "Mommy, who is it?" Khalid's expression softened instantly when he saw the little girl. Grace smiled shyly. "Hi," Khalid nodded politely. "Hello." Sarah noticed the pharmacy bag in his hand. What's that? You mentioned your father's cough last week. He hesitated slightly. I brought medicine. Sarah stared at him in disbelief. Nobody outside her family remembered details like that. Nobody cared enough to. You didn't have to do this. I know. The same answer again. Simple, calm, and somehow sincere enough to make Sarah uncomfortable. She stepped aside slowly. You can come in for a minute. Khalid entered the apartment quietly. His eyes moved across the cramped space without judgment. The old furniture, the leaking ceiling, the unpaid bills stacked beside the television. He had spent billions designing luxury hotels around the world, but somehow this tiny apartment felt more honest than any penthouse he'd ever owned. Thomas slowly stood from the couch, then suddenly froze. His face lost color instantly. Khalid noticed the reaction immediately. The old man stared at him like he had seen a ghost. No, Thomas whispered weakly. Sarah looked confused. Dad? Thomas gripped the edge of the table tightly. Khalid stepped forward carefully. Have we met before? Thomas's breathing became uneven, but before he could answer, a violent coughing fit interrupted him. Sarah rushed to help immediately. Dad, sit down. Khalid watched silently as Sarah adjusted blankets around her father with gentle patience. Then Grace climbed onto the couch beside Thomas and held his hand. The small moment hit Khalid unexpectedly hard. Because despite the poverty, despite the suffering, this family still protected each other with love. Eventually, Thomas looked back toward Khalid again. You said your name was Khalid? Yes. Thomas swallowed hard. Khalid Al-Mansouri? Sarah looked shocked. You know him? Khalid's eyes narrowed slightly. How do you know that name? Thomas stared at him silently for several seconds before answering. Years ago, I worked security in Dubai. Khalid's pulse slowed. For who? Thomas looked directly into his eyes. For the Al-Mansouri family. The room suddenly felt colder. Sarah looked between them in confusion. What's happening? Neither man answered immediately. Then Thomas spoke softly. There was an accident many years ago, a fire. His voice trembled slightly. A little girl disappeared afterward. Khalid's face hardened. Amina. Thomas looked shocked. He remembered the name instantly. You knew her? She was my sister. Sarah stopped breathing for a second. Silence crashed through the apartment. Even Grace looked confused now. Thomas slowly sat back down. I never thought I'd see anyone from that family again. Khalid's voice lowered dangerously. What does this have to do with Sarah? Thomas looked toward his daughter with visible fear in his eyes. Before he could answer, Grace suddenly pointed toward an old bookshelf. Mommy keeps Grandma's picture there. Khalid turned slowly, and then everything inside him stopped. A framed photograph rested beside old books and medicine bottles. The photo was damaged from age. One corner burned black. But the woman smiling in the picture was Amina Al-Mansouri. Older, but unmistakable. Khalid stared at the image like the world had tilted beneath his feet. Sarah looked confused again. That's my mother. Khalid's breathing became shallow. Behind him, Thomas whispered shakily, If he finds out who your mother really was, everything will come back. At that exact moment, neither of them noticed the camera flash outside the apartment window. Someone had just photographed Khalid leaving Sarah Mitchell's home. By sunrise, Boston was already talking about Sarah Mitchell. And by noon, the internet had turned her life into entertainment. A blurry photograph spread across social media like wildfire. One image showed Khalid Al-Mansouri stepping out of Sarah's apartment building late at night. Another showed Sarah standing beside him outside Bellevue restaurant. The headlines grew worse every hour. Arab billionaire secretly visiting poor waitress. Single mom captures attention of Middle Eastern tycoon. Romance or scandal? An inside Bellevue restaurant, employees gathered around phones, whispering excitedly. Vanessa Reed nearly dropped a tray when she saw the articles. "Oh my God," she gasped. "That's him!" Brenda snatched the phone immediately. Her face turned pale, because there was no mistake. The quiet man they had mocked for weeks was Khalid al-Mansouri himself, one of the wealthiest investors in the world, the owner of luxury hotel chains across 3 continents. Marcus Bennett called Bellevue less than 10 minutes later, and he was screaming. "How stupid are you people?" Marcus shouted through the phone, loud enough for nearby staff to hear. "Do you realize who that man is?" Brenda's hands shook violently. We didn't know. You humiliated Khalid al-Mansouri in front of half the city." The entire restaurant fell silent. Vanessa slowly looked toward Sarah's empty workstation, and suddenly fear replaced arrogance. Meanwhile, Sarah sat frozen inside her apartment staring at the television. Every news channel was showing the same photographs. Grace looked confused from the couch. "Mommy, why are they talking about you?" Sarah couldn't answer. Her phone had been ringing non-stop for hours. Unknown numbers, reporters, even Bellevue management. Thomas watched quietly from his chair, guilt heavy in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Sarah finally looked at him. "For what?" "For keeping secrets too long." Before Sarah could respond, another knock echoed through the apartment. This time louder, more urgent. Sarah opened the door carefully and froze again. Khalid stood outside, surrounded by 2 security vehicles parked behind him. Everything about him looked different now, not because he changed clothes, but because the truth had finally caught up to him. The power, the authority, the billionaire the world recognized. Sarah stepped back slowly. "You lied to me." Khalid's expression tightened. "I never intended to hurt you. You let everyone humiliate you while pretending to be poor. I needed to know who people truly were." Sarah laughed bitterly. "And what? I passed some kind of test?" "No." The answer came instantly. "You treated me with kindness before you knew my name. That wasn't a test." Sarah folded her arms tightly. "You should leave." Khalid lowered his voice. "We need to talk about your mother." The room fell silent instantly. Thomas closed his eyes. Sarah looked between both men. "What aren't you telling me?" Before anyone could answer, another car suddenly stopped outside the building. Then another. Camera flashes exploded through the apartment windows. Reporters. "Ms. Mitchell. Sarah, are you dating Khalid al-Mansouri? Did you know he was a billionaire? Sarah!" But Grace immediately covered her ears in fear. Sarah's face drained of color. "Oh my God." Khalid turned instantly toward his security team. "Get them away from this building now." Within seconds, security guards moved outside to block reporters from entering, but the damage was already done. Grace began crying softly. "I'm scared." Sarah rushed to hold her daughter tightly. And something changed inside Khalid as he watched it happen, because suddenly this wasn't about mystery anymore, or his missing sister, or even family secrets. This was a frightened child being destroyed by a world she never asked to enter. Sarah looked up at him with tears burning in her eyes. "This is what your world does to people." Khalid had no answer, because she was right. Hours later, Bellevue restaurant reopened for dinner service, despite the scandal. Every employee stood nervously inside the dining room waiting. Then the front doors opened, and Khalid walked in. This time, nobody laughed. Nobody smirked. Brenda nearly ran toward him. "Mr. al-Mansouri," she stammered, "if we had known—" "That's exactly the problem," Khalid interrupted calmly. The restaurant went completely silent. Brenda's face turned red. Vanessa lowered her eyes immediately. Khalid slowly looked around the room. Weeks ago, they ignored him because they thought he was poor. Now they feared him because they knew he was rich, and somehow that disgusted him even more. At that moment, Sarah entered the restaurant through the side door. The entire room turned toward her instantly. Whispers spread everywhere. Gold digger, mistress, lucky waitress. Sarah heard all of it. Her humiliation had simply changed shape. Brenda hurried toward her. "You should have told us who he was!" Sarah stared at her in disbelief. "You treated him terribly before you knew." Brenda forced a nervous laugh. "Well, misunderstandings happen." Sarah looked exhausted. "No, character happens." Several employees lowered their heads. Khalid watched her quietly. Then Marcus Bennett suddenly entered the restaurant with Richard Hale beside him. Both men immediately approached Khalid. "Mr. Al-Mansouri," Marcus said quickly, "I deeply apologize for the other night." Khalid said nothing. Marcus turned toward Sarah next. "And Miss Mitchell, Miss, I'm sorry if my jokes offended you." Sarah almost laughed at the word jokes. Before she could answer, Khalid spoke in Arabic. Cold, sharp, controlled. "An apology without sincerity is another form of disrespect." The room froze, because Sarah answered him instantly in flawless Arabic. Then perhaps people should stop apologizing only when money enters the room. Several guests stared in complete shock. Even Richard Hale looked stunned now. Brenda blinked rapidly. You speak Arabic?" Sarah realized too late what she had done. The restaurant remained silent. Then slowly, an older woman near the entrance stepped forward. She had just entered moments earlier, unnoticed. Her eyes were locked on Sarah's necklace. And suddenly her face turned white. "No," the woman whispered shakily. Khalid turned toward her immediately. "Nadia?" The older woman stepped closer, trembling. Tears filled her eyes as she pointed at Sarah's necklace. "That necklace," she whispered. "It belongs to Amina al-Mansouri." Sarah stopped breathing, and across the room, Khalid realized the truth they had been avoiding was finally about to explode. The restaurant had never been so quiet. Not during celebrity visits, not during political fundraisers, not even when famous athletes walked through the doors. But now, every sound inside Bellevue had disappeared beneath one sentence. "That necklace belongs to Amina al-Mansouri." Sarah stood frozen near the center of the dining room, while dozens of strangers stared at her. Khalid slowly turned toward the older woman. "Nadia," he said carefully, "are you certain?" Nadia Rahman looked close to tears. "I would recognize it anywhere." Her trembling gaze remained fixed on Sarah's necklace. "I helped place that chain around Amina's neck myself on her 16th birthday." Sarah instinctively stepped backward. "No," she whispered. "That's impossible." And Nadia moved closer slowly, as if afraid Sarah might disappear. "There were only 2 necklaces ever made with that engraving," she explained shakily. "One belonged to your grandmother, the other belonged to Amina." The room remained completely silent. Even Marcus Bennett had stopped pretending confidence. Sarah touched the necklace nervously. "My mother gave this to me before she died." Khalid's breathing grew heavier. "How old were you?" 5. "And your mother's name?" Sarah hesitated. The entire restaurant seemed to lean toward her answer. "Amina," she whispered finally. "Amina Mitchell." Nadia covered her mouth. "Oh God." Khalid closed his eyes briefly. For 23 years, his family had believed Amina died in the fire that destroyed part of the Al-Mansouri estate in Dubai. They searched hospitals, airports, police records. Nothing. No trace. Until now, Sarah looked overwhelmed by the tension surrounding her. "I don't understand what's happening." Khalid opened his eyes slowly. You deserve the truth. Before he could continue, Brenda interrupted nervously. Perhaps this conversation should happen privately. Khalid turned toward her with a look cold enough to silence her instantly. You lost the right to decide what happens in this room. Brenda lowered her eyes immediately. Sarah felt dizzy. Everything was happening too fast. The cameras, the whispers, the Arabic, the necklace. Now strangers were talking about her dead mother like she belonged to some powerful dynasty. None of it felt real. I need air, she whispered suddenly. She turned quickly and walked toward the back exit of the restaurant before anyone could stop her. Khalid followed immediately. Outside, freezing wind swept through the alley behind Bellevue. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself tightly. This can't be happening! Khalid stopped several feet away, careful not to overwhelm her. When was the last time you saw your mother? Sarah stared at the wet pavement. She died when I was 7. The words came quietly, painfully. She got sick very suddenly. Khalid's jaw tightened. Did she ever mention Dubai? Sarah nodded slowly. Sometimes. Her eyes filled slightly. She used to tell me stories about giant gardens and fountains and gold lights in the desert, but Khalid looked away briefly. Those were the gardens surrounding the Al-Mansouri estate. She never told me why she cried afterward, Sarah whispered. Silence stretched between them. Then the back door opened again. Thomas Mitchell stepped outside slowly, with Nadia helping him walk. The old man looked exhausted, but he also looked defeated, like someone finally too tired to keep carrying a secret. Sarah immediately turned toward him. Dad, she said shakily, tell me what's happening. Thomas closed his eyes, then finally spoke. Your mother was Amina al-Mansouri. The world seemed to stop moving. Sarah stared at him in complete disbelief. No, she was. No, Sarah repeated louder this time. You're lying. Thomas's eyes filled with guilt. After the fire in Dubai, Amina was terrified. Powerful people were fighting over family money. There were threats. He swallowed hard. I was working security for the Al-Mansouri family then. I helped her escape. Khalid looked stunned. You took her out of the country? Thomas nodded slowly. She wanted a different life, a safe life. Sarah shook her head repeatedly. My mother was a waitress. We were poor. Thomas looked at her sadly. She chose peace over wealth. Khalid's chest tightened painfully, because suddenly everything about Sarah made sense. The Arabic, the necklace, the lullaby, even the way she carried herself. Sarah backed away again, tears streaming now. All these years, she whispered. You let me believe we were alone. Thomas looked broken. I promised your mother I would protect you. By lying to me, she was afraid they would find her. Khalid stepped forward carefully. My family would never have harmed her. Thomas looked directly at him. You don't know what your father's business partners were capable of back then. That sentence hit Khalid hard, because deep down, he did know. The Al-Mansouri empire had not always been clean. Sarah wiped her face angrily. So what now? She asked bitterly. Suddenly I'm supposed to believe I belong to some billionaire family? No, Khalid said softly. You don't owe anyone that. Sarah looked at him with frustration and confusion mixed together. Then why does this feel like my entire life just exploded? Before Khalid could answer, his phone rang sharply. One of his security directors. Khalid answered immediately. What is it? His expression darkened instantly. They found reporters outside Sarah's apartment again, he said grimly, and someone leaked Grace's school location. Sarah's face turned white. No. Fear replaced every other emotion instantly. My daughter. She's safe, Khalid assured quickly. My security team already moved her. Sarah stepped toward him suddenly. You had people following my child to protect her. I didn't ask for protection. You needed it. The argument stopped abruptly when Sarah's phone began ringing. Unknown hospital number. Her hands shook as she answered. Hello? The color drained from her face within seconds. What do you mean she collapsed? Khalid immediately stepped closer. Sarah's breathing became uneven. She was at school, Sarah whispered weakly. Grace fainted. Thomas looked horrified. No. The nurse says she's barely conscious. Sarah nearly dropped the phone. Khalid caught her arm before she fell, and then came the sentence that shattered whatever remained of the night. The doctors think it may be the blood disorder. Boston General Hospital glowed beneath cold midnight rain as Sarah Mitchell ran through the emergency entrance with tears streaming down her face. Grace Mitchell, she gasped breathlessly to the front desk nurse. Where is she? This way. Khalid stayed close behind her, while his security team quietly held reporters back outside the hospital doors. Everything had spiraled out of control in less than 24 hours. The scandal, the secrets, the truth about Amina. And now Grace. Sarah's heart pounded violently as she rushed into the pediatric wing. The moment she saw her daughter lying unconscious in the hospital bed, she broke. Oh God. Grace looked impossibly small beneath the white blankets. Machines beeped softly around her, while an IV ran into her arm. Sarah collapsed beside the bed immediately, clutching Grace's tiny hand. I'm here, baby, she whispered through tears. Mommy's here. Khalid stood silently near the doorway. Something tightened painfully in his chest as he watched them, because suddenly he understood something terrifying. This child, this innocent little girl, was the last living piece of Amina. A doctor entered moments later, holding test results. Ms. Mitchell? Sarah stood quickly. Is she okay? The doctor's expression remained careful. Grace has a rare blood disorder. Thomas slowly sat down in shock nearby. We suspected it months ago, the doctor continued, but tonight's collapse confirms the condition is progressing faster than expected. Sarah's face turned pale. What does that mean? It means she'll likely need a bone marrow donor. Silence. Sarah looked completely frozen. The doctor continued carefully. Finding a compatible donor is extremely difficult with this type of condition. Khalid stepped forward immediately. Test me. Everyone turned toward him. The doctor looked confused. Sir? She's family, Khalid said firmly. Sarah stared at him. No hesitation. No discussion. Just certainty. The doctor nodded slowly. We can run testing immediately. Sarah suddenly spoke. No. The room turned toward her. Khalid frowned slightly. Sarah, you don't owe us anything. Khalid's expression softened. This isn't about obligation. Sarah looked emotionally overwhelmed. My life has already destroyed yours enough. Khalid stared at her in disbelief. Destroyed mine? She laughed bitterly through tears. You were living your billionaire life peacefully before I showed up. Khalid took a slow breath. No. The single word stopped her completely. For the first time in 23 years, he said quietly, I finally found part of my sister again. The room fell silent. Sarah looked away immediately, unable to process the emotion in his voice. Meanwhile, outside the hospital room, chaos continued growing. News stations had already learned about Grace's hospitalization. Reporters crowded the building entrance. Social media exploded with speculation. And somewhere inside Bellevue Restaurant, Brenda Collins sat trembling while watching the coverage on television. Vanessa paced nervously nearby. What if he shuts the restaurant down? Brenda's voice shook. Forget the restaurant. We publicly humiliated his family. Vanessa swallowed hard. Neither woman had slept since discovering Khalid's identity. Now every cruel comment they made to Sarah felt like a ticking bomb waiting to explode. Back at the hospital, hours passed slowly. Sarah sat beside Grace's bed while softly brushing hair from her daughter's forehead. Thomas slept in the corner chair, exhausted. Khalid remained nearby the entire night. He made calls quietly in Arabic, arranging specialists, private consultations, and every possible treatment option money could buy. Yet none of it mattered if they couldn't find a donor. Near dawn, the doctor finally returned carrying new test results. Everyone stood immediately. The doctor looked directly at Khalid first. "We received the DNA results." Sarah's breath caught. The room became completely still. The doctor opened the folder slowly. "Sarah Mitchell is biologically related to Khalid al-Mansouri." Tears instantly filled Nadia Rahman's eyes. Thomas lowered his head silently. Sarah looked completely numb. The doctor continued. "Specifically, Sarah is the daughter of Amina al-Mansouri." Khalid closed his eyes briefly. His sister. After all these years. Gone. But not completely gone, because part of her had survived through Sarah. Sarah began crying quietly, not loudly, not dramatically. Just the kind of silent crying that comes when a lifetime suddenly changes forever. Khalid stepped closer carefully. "You are family," he whispered. Sarah shook her head weakly. "I don't even know what that means anymore." Before Khalid could answer, the doctor looked back down at the paperwork. "There's something else." Everyone tensed immediately. The doctor inhaled slowly. "Khalid is a near-perfect donor match for Grace." The room froze. Sarah stared at the doctor in shock. "What?" "With this level of compatibility," the doctor explained carefully, "Grace's chances improve dramatically." Khalid didn't hesitate even 1 second. "When do we begin?" Sarah looked at him in disbelief. "You would really do that?" Khalid turned toward Grace's hospital bed. "That child carries my sister's blood." His voice cracked slightly for the first time. "And yours?" Sarah suddenly covered her mouth as emotion overwhelmed her completely. For years, she had faced life alone. No safety net, no family support, no one willing to sacrifice anything for her. And now a man she had met only weeks ago was prepared to undergo painful medical procedures to save her daughter. Not because of money, not because of publicity. Because he loved someone Sarah never even had the chance to remember properly. Hours later, Khalid completed every required test and signed every consent form. Meanwhile, Brenda and Vanessa quietly arrived at the hospital carrying flowers. Fear and guilt covered both their faces. Brenda approached Sarah carefully. "Sarah, we're so sorry." Sarah looked exhausted. Vanessa stepped forward quickly. "We didn't know who you were." Sarah slowly lifted her eyes toward them, and the sadness in her expression somehow hurt more than anger would have. "That's the problem," she whispered. "You thought kindness depended on who someone was." Neither woman could answer, because she was right. Days later, after the procedure, Grace finally opened her eyes weakly inside recovery. Sarah immediately rushed beside her. "Baby?" Grace smiled faintly. Then her tired eyes slowly shifted toward Khalid sitting quietly nearby. The little girl studied him carefully for several seconds, then softly asked, "Are you the uncle Mommy cried about?" Khalid's face broke completely, and for the first time in years, the billionaire who trusted nobody suddenly couldn't stop tears from falling. 3 weeks later, snow began melting across Boston. For the first time in months, sunlight reached through the windows of Sarah Mitchell's apartment instead of gray winter clouds. and for the first time in years, the apartment felt hopeful. Grace sat cross-legged on the couch coloring pictures while humming softly to herself. Her cheeks finally carried color again. The dark circles beneath Sarah's eyes had slowly begun fading too. Recovery had not been easy. But Grace was alive. That alone felt like a miracle. "Mommy?" Grace asked while drawing carefully. "Do rich people always wear black coats?" Sarah smiled faintly from the kitchen. "I don't think so." "Then why does Uncle Khalid wear one every day?" A quiet laugh escaped Sarah before she could stop it, because somehow, despite everything that had happened, Grace had become strangely attached to Khalid al-Mansouri. The billionaire visited almost every day, sometimes bringing books, sometimes food, sometimes simply sitting beside Grace while she watched cartoons, and every single time, he still arrived dressed simply. No expensive suits, no arrogant displays of wealth, just quiet presence. A soft knock interrupted the morning. Grace immediately jumped up excitedly. "Uncle Khalid!" Sarah opened the door to find Khalid standing there, holding hot chocolate for Grace and medical paperwork for Thomas. "You spoil her," Sarah said softly. Khalid glanced toward Grace warmly. "She deserves joy." Grace grabbed the hot chocolate happily before running back toward the couch. Khalid stepped inside quietly. His eyes moved toward Thomas, who looked healthier than he had weeks earlier. Khalid had arranged private treatment for him without ever mentioning cost. Thomas still seemed uncomfortable accepting help. But Sarah knew the truth. Without Khalid, her father might not have survived the year. "You didn't have to do all this," Sarah said quietly once Grace disappeared into her bedroom. Khalid looked at her calmly. "Yes," he replied. "I did." Sarah leaned against the counter silently. There were still moments when everything felt unreal. Weeks ago, she had been a waitress struggling to buy groceries. Now, reporters followed her through grocery stores, while news articles called her the lost al-Mansouri heir. But inside, she still felt like the same exhausted woman carrying 2 jobs and unpaid bills. Khalid seemed to understand that. He never pressured her to change, never tried to buy her loyalty, and somehow that mattered more than the money itself. Meanwhile, across the city, Bellevue restaurant was collapsing under scandal. Videos from the night Sarah was humiliated had leaked online. Millions watched Marcus Bennett spill wine on her uniform. Millions watched Brenda blame Sarah instead of defending her. Public outrage exploded instantly. Customers canceled reservations. Sponsors withdrew support. And 3 days later, Brenda Collins was called into an emergency meeting. She entered confidently, until she saw Khalid sitting at the head of the conference table. Her face lost all color. Khalid remained calm. "My company finalized acquisition of Bellevue this morning." Brenda's knees nearly gave out. The billionaire now owned the restaurant where she publicly humiliated his family. Marcus Bennett had already lost 2 business contracts connected to Khalid's investors. Richard Hale publicly distanced himself from the scandal, and Vanessa Reed quietly resigned before she could be fired. Brenda tried desperately to speak. "Mr. al-Mansouri, I know I made mistakes." "Mistakes?" Khalid interrupted quietly. His voice never rose. It didn't need to. "You mocked poor people because you believed wealth determined human value." Brenda's eyes filled with panic. "I was under pressure." "No," Khalid said calmly. "You were honest." The room fell silent, because deep down, Brenda knew he was right. Khalid slid an envelope across the table. "Your employment ends today." Brenda stared at the papers with trembling hands, and for the first time in years, she finally understood what helplessness felt like. But Sarah never celebrated any of it. When reporters asked whether she wanted revenge, her answer shocked everyone. "I don't want revenge," she said quietly outside Boston General Hospital one afternoon. "I want people to stop treating struggling workers like they're invisible." That clip spread across social media faster than the scandal itself. Even Khalid watched it repeatedly in silence. Because despite everything Sarah suffered, she still refused bitterness. One evening, Khalid invited Sarah and Grace to dinner at a private rooftop garden overlooking the city skyline. Sarah almost refused at first, not because she feared him anymore, but because she feared becoming dependent on a world she didn't understand. Still, Grace begged excitedly, so Sarah agreed. Warm lights glowed softly around the rooftop, while snow drifted gently beyond the glass walls. Grace sat beside Khalid, happily eating chocolate cake. "You know," Grace announced seriously, "Mommy used to cry a lot before you came." Sarah nearly choked on her drink. "Grace." "What?" "It's true." Khalid looked toward Sarah quietly. Something painful moved behind his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said softly. Sarah frowned slightly. "For what?" "For not finding you sooner." The honesty in his voice silenced her completely, because suddenly she realized something important. Khalid carried guilt too, not for what he did, for what life failed to protect. After dinner, Grace fell asleep curled beside the fireplace inside the rooftop lounge. Boston shimmered quietly below them. Khalid handed Sarah a sealed envelope. "What's this? Open it later." Sarah narrowed her eyes suspiciously. "If this is money, it isn't charity." His answer came immediately. Sarah studied him carefully before taking the envelope slowly. Khalid looked out toward the city lights. "My sister deserved better than fear," he said quietly, "and you deserved better than survival." Sarah felt emotion tighten painfully in her chest. For years, nobody had spoken about her life like it mattered. Not truly. Then Khalid turned back toward her. "This is not charity," he repeated softly. "It's justice." Sarah looked down at the envelope in her hands, and suddenly realized her life was about to change once again. Sarah Mitchell opened the envelope the next morning while Grace ate cereal beside the kitchen window. At first, she thought it was another legal document connected to the Al-Mansouri family. But as she read the first page, her hands slowly began to tremble. "What is it?" Thomas asked softly from the couch. Sarah looked up in shock. "It's a foundation." Thomas frowned slightly. "What kind of foundation?" Sarah swallowed hard before reading aloud. "The Amina Grace Foundation." Grace immediately smiled. "That has my name." Sarah kept reading silently. The foundation would provide financial assistance, housing support, medical aid, and legal protection for struggling single mothers, immigrant families, and low-income workers facing discrimination. And according to the documents, Sarah would be the executive director. Her eyes widened. Khalid can't be serious. At that exact moment, another envelope slipped from the paperwork. Inside was a handwritten note, not typed, not prepared by assistants, written personally by Khalid himself. "You spent your entire life protecting people while nobody protected you. Build something that changes that for others." Sarah stared at the sentence for a long time, then quietly sat down. Because for the first time in years, someone saw her strength instead of her struggle. 3 weeks later, reporters crowded outside the grand ballroom of the Al-Mansouri Hotel in downtown Boston. But this time, Sarah was not standing outside carrying food trays. This time, she walked through the front entrance, and the entire room turned toward her. Camera flashes exploded instantly. Yet Sarah barely noticed them. She wore a simple, elegant, cream-colored dress. Nothing flashy. Nothing designed to impress wealthy people. Because she wasn't there to impress anyone anymore. Grace walked proudly beside her, holding Khalid's hand. And for once, Sarah no longer looked like a woman surviving. She looked like someone finally breathing freely. Inside the ballroom sat investors, journalists, politicians, and business leaders from across the country. Many were the same types of people who once ignored women like Sarah every single day. Near the front row, Brenda Collins watched quietly from a distance, no longer a manager, no longer powerful, just another person forced to confront the consequences of her own cruelty. Vanessa sat nearby too, unable to meet Sarah's eyes. Meanwhile, Khalid stood near the stage, dressed in a dark tailored suit, speaking softly with reporters. Yet despite the luxury surrounding him, his attention kept drifting toward Sarah and Grace. Because deep down, none of this felt as important as the family he almost lost forever. The event began precisely at 7 o'clock. A massive screen behind the stage displayed the foundation's name, the Amina Grace Foundation. Below it appeared one sentence: "No one deserves to be treated as less than human." The ballroom fell silent as Khalid stepped to the microphone first. "For many years," he said calmly, "I believed success meant building empires." His deep voice echoed through the room. "But recently, someone reminded me that character matters far more than wealth." His eyes moved toward Sarah briefly. "And kindness shown to strangers can change lives in ways we never expect." The audience listened carefully, some emotional, some uncomfortable, especially those who remembered how publicly Sarah had once been humiliated. Khalid stepped away from the microphone slowly. Then Sarah's name was announced. For a brief moment, fear returned, not because she doubted herself, but because the little waitress from Bellevue restaurant still existed somewhere inside her, the woman who spent years apologizing for taking up space. Grace squeezed her hand gently. "You got this, Mommy." Sarah smiled softly, then walked onto the stage. The ballroom immediately erupted into applause, not polite applause, real applause. And somehow that almost hurt more, because months earlier, these same kinds of people would never have looked twice at her. Sarah stood quietly behind the microphone, while cameras flashed endlessly around her. Then finally she spoke. "I used to believe invisible people stayed invisible forever." The room became completely silent. Sarah looked around slowly. "When you work long hours for little money, when people speak down to you every day, when your child watches you come home crying," her voice shook slightly, "you start believing maybe the world already decided what your value is." Several people lowered their eyes, because they knew exactly the kind of people she meant. "But kindness changed my life," Sarah continued softly. "Not money first, kindness first." Khalid watched her silently from nearby. Emotion filled his eyes again. Sarah took a slow breath. "The world teaches us to judge people by clothes, accents, jobs, neighborhoods, or bank accounts." She looked around the ballroom carefully. "But the worst mistake a human being can make is believing someone struggling deserves less dignity." The audience remained completely still. Even reporters stopped typing, because nobody expected the former waitress to speak with such calm truth. Sarah smiled faintly. "I was a waitress people ignored." Her eyes glistened slightly. "Today, I stand here because one person chose to see me as human before knowing who I was." Khalid lowered his head briefly. Grace suddenly shouted proudly from the front row, "That's my mommy!" The ballroom burst into warm laughter and applause. Sarah laughed softly through tears. And somehow, that small moment healed something broken inside everyone watching. Later that night, after reporters left and guests disappeared, Sarah returned quietly to Bellevue restaurant with Khalid and Grace. The building had changed ownership completely now. New staff, new policies, new management. But one thing remained the same. The table near the window. The very table where Khalid first ordered in Arabic, while everyone believed he was poor. Grace climbed into the booth happily. Khalid sat across from Sarah quietly. Outside, snow drifted gently through the Boston streets again. But this time, the silence between them felt peaceful instead of lonely. Sarah looked around the restaurant slowly. So much changed because of one sentence in Arabic. Khalid smiled faintly. No. Sarah looked at him curiously. Khalid's eyes softened as he glanced toward Grace. The richest thing I found this year, he said quietly, was never money. And for the first time in a very long time, the billionaire who trusted nobody finally felt like he had come home. Kindness costs nothing, but it can change someone's entire life. Never judge people by their clothes, jobs, accents, or struggles, because the strongest hearts are often hidden behind the hardest lives. True character is revealed in how we treat people when we believe they have nothing to offer us. Comment where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more emotional stories that remind us what truly matters.